Hi everyone, welcome to Reflections. This is Mel Gabby, and the topic tonight is mental health. So, what I'm going to do is this is just really about some of the information that will help you when you're considering your own mental health. And I'm talking about really people in the UK because the system's kind of different than it is in the US, but there will be some overlap. Um, so I'm Mel Gabby, and as you know, for those of you that have heard my work before, I have a YouTube channel and I have some social media platforms where I post a range of different topics and themes that are relevant actually in different aspects of my life because fundamentally I believe that if you do the things that you love, that light you up, that make you feel good, you're going to improve how you feel anyway and going to improve your mental health. But why do I know this? Where does this come from? What makes me credible to talk about mental health and well-being in the way that I do? So, first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about me and where some of these ideas come from. And then I'm going to talk about the mental health data and prevalence and some of the information that might help you if you're trying to navigate any of the services, whether they're NHS, local authority, or private. And then some of the key things that might help you in terms of where you are now. So, do bear with me. Just to go back a little bit, this is my probably say third career, but I started training as psychotherapist in 1995 when my youngest son was just a few years old. And I decided, after doing some voluntary work with the Samaritans and being encouraged to go and do some training, to take up a short course. I didn't really have the confidence to study back then because I hadn't done so well in school for all sorts of reasons that I talk about on other podcasts. And I took up a therapy course. So initially, I only took an introduction. Then I went on and did the certificate. And back then, and it still is pretty common for it to be a 3 or 4 year course. And so after the first 2 years of doing the certificate level, I then did the diploma. So I qualified in 99, but I actually started working with real people from about 1997. Started working with adults, and I work with a range of people from a range of backgrounds. I live in a multi-diverse area, and we have people from all sorts of walks of life. 99 I qualified and I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I ended up being offered a project working in a school as a small sort of thing they were trying to do at the moment at that time in local authorities, and that was supporting kids at risk of being excluded from schools. Back then, when the Labour government was in and the school exclusion rates were fairly significant, we were given a sort of task force in each area to put in a range of different approaches to prevent this from happening. And we were identifying really that a lot of these young people that were struggling in school have had learning difficulties or mental and emotional health issues, which are fairly common and understood today. But they weren't so much over 25 years ago. So it was quite a niche area. Very few areas had therapists going into schools, but we also had a behaviour support unit that would do social skills groups, circle time work, which came from Jenny Mosley. Anyone who's worked in the education department will know pretty well who Jenny Mosley was. She does amazing work of group work and helping kids become more happy, confident, better self esteem, all of those sorts of great things. So I did that for a while, and then I took on a big project working with kids in transition because anyone who's struggling in primary school with their learning, with their self esteem, their confidence, may start to have difficulties in secondary school. In particular, the kids that had any sort of behavioural difficulties, often motivated or informed by any emotional issues they were experiencing. So I did that for a few years. And then I took over running a mental health and wellbeing service. It was called a comprehensive CAM service. Basically, at that time, there were primary mental health workers who had training as therapists, had degrees, but also a good understanding of mental health. And we supported the local CAMS areas with children who didn't make the criteria for CAMS. So that's child and adolescent mental health services. Anyone that's got any child with extra needs who's on the waiting list for ASD or ADHD, has got any anxiety, depression issues, or any issues with self harm, will know what the CAM services are about. The equivalent is adult mental health for anyone who's over 18, and that varies from area to area whether or not you have a service for those coming from children's services to adult services. So I ran that service for a number of years and managed between 600 and 1,000 referrals coming into service. And I supported the staff at the time, trained up the clinicians to do what we called social and emotional assessments, looking at what were the difficulties that they faced, how long had they experienced them, what had influenced any of those issues in school, at home. Were there any issues, say, like, was a parent that was sick, someone's out of work, with family stress, was the child struggling with their own learning, had they seen anything that had upset them, that had created any issues, or were there longer term, deeper issues within the family? So we processed over 600 to 1,000 referrals a year, and a proportion of those referrals, if they needed to go towards a diagnosis, in particular for ASD or ADHD, we would support the families and the schools in making sure those children were able to access those services that back then still had a waiting list, but not to the degree that they have now. So I ran those services and I left the local authority in 2016 after being and running that service for over 8 years. We took mindfulness into play therapy, drama therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, with all sorts of therapies into the schools. And we also supported the youth services, educational psychology teams, and I worked closely with public health. And it's when I started to work with public health that I started to get a really good idea about what the prevalence and issues were with mental health and health issues across the country, because public health actually collects the data. It's not always up to date data, but they've got a fairly good idea each year. And that data is meant to inform each area as to how they spend the money and what kind of services they need. So I've been very involved in children and adults, mental health and wellbeing services up until 2016. In 2016, 2018, I worked for NHS England and I was the quality improvement lead on services in Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and um, well, I've lost it, Berkshire. Excuse me. I then worked for the universities, and we were part of implementing what are now called mental health support teams that were going into schools, supporting them to. They were basically clinical staff who were getting trained in the universities to go in and do short pieces of work initially with children and young people, but of course that was always going to be much more demanding and complex than anyone could anticipate. So that's my background. Meanwhile, I have followed the spiritual path since I was a kid, but in particular started to focus much more consciously from about 2011. A lot of people had major shifts in their lives around 89 and 2012, and this was just before the cusp of where lots more people were opening up. So I pursued a lot of spiritual courses and developed my intuition, and also started to do training in things like Reiki, quantum touch healing, because basically I was working with a range of people and they all came with different issues but also respond to different approaches. So in the therapy world we call that more eclectic. So I had an approach that I was taught with the Human Givers Institute that helps you work with somebody right at the beginning and look at what tools you can help them learn so that they can start to make some improvements on their life straight away. um, so that's my sort of history. I practiced yoga for about a decade until 2019. because I experienced quite a bit of stress with running services. So I oversaw some of the programs. I did a lot of project management, creative projects that were going into schools and into services, and I delivered mental health training to over 500 staff in the schools across the area. So I've been deep diving into mental health and well-being certainly since 2008. What I found before then is very few counsellors or therapists actually did any training in mental health to the degree that you need to have to understand really the way that we look at the language of mental health and the terminology we use, especially when clients are coming to us more and more now, saying they've got a diagnosis of something. And in another podcast, I look at the distinction between mental health and well-being and how it has been influenced and changed in the last 100 years with the advent of medication as well, uh, to help support people who might be struggling. So if you're listening to this and you're in a crisis and you're really struggling, then do get support. I find the Samaritans are brilliant because you can ring them up at any time of day or night. Mind or Young Minds was always a good service, and whatever local services you've got, don't suffer in silence. For men, Calm was a great service. We used to do some work with them when I did work for public health. I think they were funded in some areas, and they really support men. Um, and that's what we saw, a sort of growing need, in particular around midlife, because there are certain time points in people's life where they may be more likely to experience a mental health issue. So that's my backstory. I'm also trained as a yoga and meditation teacher. I do these podcasts. And I like traveling in my camper van and doing photography and basically enjoying life as much as I can. And my whole focus really, and it also comes from coaching, has been what tools can I uh, utilize to support me to develop my mental health and well-being and also elicit better states of consciousness. And so the barriers between psychology, psychotherapy, and spirituality in my world don't really exist because I incorporate a lot of those different practices with the clients that I support one to one or when I do group work. So I do teach on some courses and I run some private coaching groups. So if you do want to contact me, then just email me at mailgbb555@hotmail.com. There's lots of free material on my website and lots of, not so many of the podcasts I've done. I started doing podcasts about 2 years ago, but there's quite a lot of podcasts on Spotify. If you put Mel Gabbi in there, Bridging Psychology and Spirituality, or Mel Gabbi and Friends. And in YouTube, I've got quite a few of um, my podcast, but I've also got the new range. The more recent range are the smaller time points on reflections, and so this will form one of those. Um, so, in terms of what motivates me really to keep my finger on the pulse when it comes to mental health and well-being, is one is because of the clients I come into contact with. Two is the language that we're using isn't always really understandable to a lot of people. I think we use a lot of language, don't really know what it means. So I help people understand what that can mean, help them to understand how they can access different services depending on what the difficulties they have that they're facing, and help them unravel a little bit of the type of different type of therapists that they can work with, because there's a whole range of different support out there. You can have people who are trained in NLP and coaching, they work a lot in business, but you can have coaches who do one-to-one work with private clients. A lot of psychotherapists are trained in a variety of approaches, but in the NHS it's predominantly CBT, although they do some interpersonal therapy. And there are specialists who work with trauma, but we also know from the emerging research that with trauma, um, somatic work like yoga, meditation can really help. But again, they are topics for deeper conversation on different podcasts. So, the prevalence of mental health, let's bring it up to date. Did you know in terms of children and young people, in 2023, 20% of children aged 8 to 16 had a probable mental disorder. So when we're saying probable, it's more likely, and it depends on where this data's come from. But I would say it's probably higher, to be fair, if I look back at my own history. And I was working in mental health and wellbeing until 2023, um, and was still really getting access to a lot of the reports and the data. So, when we say a mental disorder, a disorder usually means that they can be diagnosed. So, I think before it used to be 1 in 10, and now they're talking about 20%. And diagnosed means that you've had a set of symptoms that meet a certain criteria for, say, anxiety or depression for a certain time period. So it might be a month or 3 months, but what they normally say is if you've had a general feeling of anxiety, depression, low mood, felt very blue for more than 2 weeks, then it's usually the time to go and seek help. However, I think we underestimate sometimes how when people are going through transition, when they've lost a job, um, there's a death in the family. These are situations that really would throw somebody into a crisis, or, uh, without experience emotions like grief, loss, sadness. So that would be perfectly understandable. We also have a lot of people in the workspace. I'm going to do a different podcast on mental health in the workplace. I've done a podcast with Julie on my YouTube page where we explored both of our experiences of burnout and some of the difficulties uh, that arise at work, and also how we're really being challenged these days to think about the kind of things that impact us and whether or not we need to reassess what we're doing, where, with who, what kind of work we're doing, if we love that work, or we get into a point in time where we need to really reevaluate and see whether or not that's still the right kind of work for us. Easier said than done, I know, but the path of meaning and purpose has become a lot more prevalent now, and people are really starting to think about, rather than wait until they retire, how can they really enjoy life. So, one of the concerns was eating disorders, and we know that the rates of eating disorders went up. I know that during COVID, the figures that we had pre-COVID dramatically rose in some areas. We started to see people coming through the system that never would have even probably entered into any of the crisis services or the mental health services at the time. They would have been coping fairly well. But COVID had placed a massive strain on a whole range of people, and we saw those numbers drastically increase. So, in terms of mental health support, I know that when I started working at NHS England, there was a real drive to use the money from the health services departments to implement, to train up new clinical staff and create what are known as mental health support teams that go into schools. They were only working with about 35% of the pupils, and were trying to identify those that could really benefit from a low to medium intervention. But we also know there was a quite a high range of students that needed something much more longer term. But it was a good start. It was where we were putting people clinically trained to go into the schools to support the young people. The universities had project team managers who was supporting those projects to move forward. How they're doing, what the data is on that, I haven't read a report for a while, but I know it is quite problematic setting up a service in school. When I worked in schools, it was very different in every school. But the one that I actually practiced as a therapist at, I was there 2 days a week, and there was a therapist prior to that time in the school. So the kids already had built up trust, and trust is one of the key features, so that they would come and knock on the door and have a chat or set up some sessions with you. Um, there's a lot of survey data that comes from something called strength and difficulty questionnaires. Although what we know in services is you're meant to do a sort of pre and post data set. They're rarely done. The second ones are rarely done. So the data's incomplete or inaccurate. So I won't be sharing too much of the data because Where it comes from, who does it, and how accurate it is always been what we call FUPS, kind of flawed. Um, and we also know there's impacts of socio-economic factors. So global disease massively impacted the mental health of the nation, adults and children. And we also know things like bullying is so underplayed, the impact that bullying has on young people in schools, as well as those that are struggling in schools. And they can lead to things like substance use, self harm. And then we've got the extra layers of the cost of living, education, climate change on the mental health. So the more and more people become aware, and I think this is what I find in my spiritual work, is it's all very well to develop your awareness, but it's about how you manage the information and not get consumed by the fear that we're going to become extinct, or that there's going to be nothing left by the time people have done their education. There's so many fears out there that are fueled by social media. In terms of adults, 2014 adult psychiatric morbidity survey found that 1 in 6 adults had experienced symptoms of common mental health problems like depression and anxiety. I mean, I actually think that depression and anxiety is fairly normal. I think most of us get some level of anxiety, and many of us can experience depression or at least low mood. I mean, I think everybody's had a time when they've, not wanted to get out of bed. And I'm not saying that clinical depression is just about a case of not wanting to get out of bed. Clinical depression is when your depression impacts every aspect of your life, where you change your eating habits. You might just, not change your clothes. You don't wash as much. You don't go out. You lose contact with friends. It's affecting your sleep, and your mood can be drastically morbid as well. Um, if you're in that state, it's certainly definitely a good idea to go and see your doctor. Or if you can afford it, go and see a therapist that's got experience of working with people who's got some mental health issues that have been going on for a while. So the access to mental health services has always been a problem in the UK, because every time we create a service, um, it doesn't take long before capacity sort of hits demand, or the demand hits the capacity, as in the services are only set up to meet what we think are the needs in the population based on the data that is inaccurate. And so we never quite got enough staff to deal with the need. But the astonishing numbers in 2022 and 2023 was 3.58 million people were in contact with mental health services, representing just over 6% of the population. So we do know that we've got data of when people make calls into crisis services, and again, how accurate that data is. But I know the numbers did go up, because we used to run the program boards across the southeast, and people, heads of services would be reporting that. Now, the thing is, with their adult mental health services, it really is a lucky dip and a postcode lottery as to whether or not you get any service at all, and whether they will see you, or if you end up in a crisis situation, whether or not there's any service after crisis. We know that where they've done trial, up to date, sort of good crisis services, you've been seen very quickly when you've gone into a crisis service and had very good after treatment, and then been supported even if you don't need as much support after a few weeks or a few months. Where it isn't there is where what we have, a rolling door situation, where people who've got serious mental health issues are in and out of A&E or crisis services all the time, and that does place a big demand on those services. So sadly, personal opinion, no. Personal opinion and data is accessing adult mental health services is really problematic. And so that's why we have um, EAP services, which is access to psychological support in the workplace. Often you only get offered 6 or 12 sessions. So you can do some really good short term work if you and your therapist match, and their style and what you need is a good match too. And you can maybe you need a bit of respite, you need to be able to talk to somebody, or you need to be able to just share some of the things that bother you that you haven't told anyone else. And that's usually something that can really make a big difference to people and how they feel. But for people who've had issues that have been going on for a while, 6 to 12 sessions isn't always enough. Now, Most of the people in those services will be counselors and psychotherapists, will have different levels of experience and background. So I would just suggest that you find someone that you click with, and that you feel that you can open up to and share what's going on. And then have a look on YouTube or on Google, at people who talk about personal development, and click on any of the videos that are relevant to you, because there is so much information out there that we can listen to and also utilize some of the hacks that they give us, and they can make a big difference. There's a lot of coaches that work, some are in services, a lot work privately, and coaching can work really well as well. That they can You can do a realistic review of where you're at and what's impacting you. But there are key areas, and this is why well-being is prevalent to think about. If you have different issues in different aspects of your life, then you can get overwhelmed, and your well-being and mental health will be affected. So what we know in well-being circles is that if you start to focus on any one area in your life, it will invariably have an impact on the rest. But we know in mental health, for example, if your nutrition is quite poor, that does have a direct correlation on your mental health. Lack of movement, not getting out, going for walks, going swimming, things like that, again, can have an impact. So, thinking about who your friends are, how often you connect with them, spending time with people, having fun, access to, if you're struggling financially, access to financial support, and doing things that are free, getting out there, going out your comfort zone, learning some new things. Doing that will increase your confidence and your well-being. But of course, if you're anxious or you've got a low mood, it can be harder to do things like that. So, what you eat, the water that you drink, having an adequate sleep, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, all of those contribute to your well-being. So, when you see somebody, especially a coach, and that's what we did with people who are coming through our service, we were supporting them. Where are you right now? What are you doing right now? And what are the small steps that you can take? And the key word is small steps. So, the average time for waiting for assessment and treatment, we know in children's services with the mental health teams, it could be within the week. It depends on whether or not they've generated a waiting list. And we know in CAMP services, depends on the service, but you can be waiting, 3 months, 6 months, or a year. If you're waiting for a ASD, an autism or ADHD assessment, then you could be waiting a year to 18 months. And that's the same in adult services. So it's not going to be something that happens quickly. We also know that a lot of people go to private psychiatrists and will get diagnosed with them. But the only thing you need to remember is you will also, unless you are under any of the new projects that are supported by NHS England, your local commissioners, GPs, to utilise private services, that they will also give you an NHS prescription. So if you don't pay for your prescriptions, you will when you go private, and that's the only thing. Um, the There are different areas that have different variations of the numbers of people with mental health issues, but we know that poverty is connected. If financial issues, or they're going to impact your mental health, and we have pockets of areas where mental health prevalence is much worse, and it's the same with health as well, like diabetes, heart disease. So we haven't really got up-to-date data on the adults waiting for mental health assessments and treatments, because the program for adults is different for that of children. But we know there are long waiting times to get any support. If you want to go to your GP, it's very difficult to get an appointment with your GP, but it depends on where you live. Some people are doing okay. In some other areas, it's like where I live, it's just abysmal, let alone trying to get referred to any adult mental health services. Although GPs can refer you to adult IAPS, which is basically access to psychological services. Um, so that's ADHD and ASD. There are some really good information online, and Andrew Huberman, who is a researcher and does brain scanning, uh, does a lot of videos on his YouTube page about ASD and ADHD. So I'd certainly recommend Andrew Huberman. In terms of It's meant to be getting better in terms of access and waiting time standards, but you can reduce the waiting time, and then if you have health sickness, or we're not training people, as many people as we did before, um, and then we've got